Joe Folley, welcome to the podcast. It's pretty cool to have you here. Thank you for doing this.
Oh no, thank you very much for having me.
So we're going to talk about fine-tuning and the pronounced philosophical differences between us. So if you're new to the conversation, the fine-tuning argument for God is that there are certain features of the laws of physics, certain parameters, such that if you change their values, even slightly, up or down, the physics that results from those new parameter values is completely inhospitable to life and complex structure of any kind, usually. So that another way of framing it is that the range of possible values for these parameters is huge compared to the life-permitting range. It's very small. So one very common example that I give and that many authors give is the cosmological constant. This is one of the contributing factors to how fast the universe expands. So if the value of the cosmological constant were slightly smaller, the universe would have recollapsed in on itself shortly after the Big Bang, which obviously there's no life there. You can't have life in a situation like that. Conversely, if the cosmological constant were slightly larger, the universe would have expanded so rapidly that galaxies couldn't have formed, any complex structure could not have formed. You'd have a diffused gas of hydrogen and helium, and once again, no life. So that gives an idea of like what fine-tuning is. It's this precarious balance within physics that allows for life. So then the question will be, how does one best explain this fact? Some people think it doesn't need an explanation. Some people think it does. I think it does. And the fine-tuning argument for God will claim that theism or the design hypothesis is the best explanation for fine-tuning. That if there's a God, it's not all that unlikely that we would encounter a universe fine-tuned for life. God would probably create such a universe. By contrast, if there is no God, if the natural world is all there is, then the likelihood of fine-tuning just happening by chance or as a brute fact is extremely small. The physicist Luke Barnes estimates that it's 1 part in 10 to the 136th power. That's 1 part in 1 followed by 136 zeros. It's real small. It's real small. To give you context, the number of particles it's particles. Number of particles in the observable universe is 1 part in 10 to the 80, which is actually an extraordinarily small subsection of that 1 part in 10 to the 136. So that's what we're talking about. And then the point will be that if theism makes fine-tuning pretty likely and naturalism makes it hideously unlikely, well, the fact that we observe fine-tuning, that's pretty good evidence for theism over naturalism. So that's the fine-tuning argument in a nutshell. And I'm more inclined to it than Joe is. Joe, why don't you get us started with just an overview of 1 or 2 issues one might raise with this simple fine-tuning argument for theism, and we'll go from there.
Yes, so I think that I'll raise a couple. One of which is popular, but I don't think is ultimately very good. And the other one, which I think is I go back and forth on, but I think has a lot of potential to it, though. I think as we'll discover, it ends up entailing quite a few interesting things, which might be fun to explore. The one that people often reach for, that I think is a real shame, because I don't think it really dissolves the problem at all, is this like anthropic objection, where someone says something like, oh, well, if the universe weren't fine-tuned for life, then we wouldn't be here to experience it. So that has to be factored into our as a background assumption when we're doing our probabilistic evaluations. And yes. I'm not generally a fan of that. I think it has some like really odd, just really odd things follow from this idea. The classic example that people give, and you'll be able to tell me who gave this because I'm bad with names, is the firing squad example, right? Where someone is lined up against a wall and 15 expert marksmen fire at them. And if they all miss, we should think there should be some way to explain that. But following this anthropic reasoning, someone that person who's just survived seemingly unbeatable odds could say something like, well, of course, like there's no universe in which I can both survive and make this judgment, because if I wasn't here, I wouldn't be able to say anything. And that seems to be the sort of reasoning that the anthropic objection allows. We don't tend to, I don't think we tend to want that. At least I don't want that, right? That seems like a really spurious line. Like, imagine that this happened to you and somebody came up to you and said, well, there's no reason for it. It's just that if I I wouldn't be around to make this judgment if I didn't survive. So, hey hum. And I that's one of the reasons why I tend not to like that so much. But it's by far the most popular response I see to the fine-tuning arguments. And I would like to throw a little bit of water on that fire if I can. I'm sure there are. I know that there are responses people have given to this, but I really do think that the anthropic objection might be a bit of a red herring. I think that, for me, the most persuasive arguments against fine-tuning normally are to do with establishing what the relevant notion of possibility would be. So we've got this, the claim being made is that the universe as it currently exists with all of its relevant properties is incredibly unlikely under a naturalistic worldview, or just a kind of non-theistic worldview, let's say. And I think that one of the stronger arguments against fine-tuning is to question the justification for that judgment. Like, what you can do this in two directions, right? One, well, you can do this a number of directions, but let's stick with a couple. One is to say something like, well, I don't know to what extent physical constants can co-vary, because in order to establish that as a fact, I would have to observe universes forming, or I'd have to observe other universes. That seems like the kind of thing that I can't do. Well, maybe if someone in the audience has access to other possible worlds, that would be really handy. But I can't. Right. I certainly can't. And so, to that extent, it seems like this notion of other ways the physical constants could have been are possible in a kind of metaphysically heavyweight sense, right? Because there's a kind of it seems like there are two notions of possibility that are often at play here. One of which is simple non-contradiction, right? So Rudolf Carnap famously had a notion of possibility that was both model relative and involved this idea of non-contradiction. So something is possible in this Carnapian sense within a given model if it just doesn't contradict any of the foundational axioms of that model, foundational assumptions of that model. Mm-hmm. That seems to be implicitly, the kind of idea of possibility that's often being appealed to on fine-tuning. This kind of something is possible until proven otherwise. Like, it's kind of a rough way to capture the intuition here. And one way that you could question this is to say, well, this idea of non-contradiction, not contradicting with some kind of foundational assumption in the model we're working with, it's an open question how much metaphysical stuff you can hang on a notion of possibility like that, because it seems like it's fundamentally a very formal notion, right? Like that's if you were to rephrase the fine-tuning argument by replacing every notion of every use of the word possible with non-contradictory, it doesn't seem like it has quite the same weight. So this suggests that we want a slightly more heavyweight notion of possibility, and there are plenty of people that have argued for very heavyweight notions of possibility. We can have a talk about kind of anti-realist and realist notions of modality, because I might go out on a complete limb and defend David Lewis's concrete modal realism, but which would be very good for the fine-tuning argument, I would say. It's interesting. But this idea of like I think that like a lot of disagreements between atheism and theism, I think that disagreements between or agnosticism and theism, because I wouldn't call myself an atheist, but a lot of the disagreements here are downstream of prior disagreements about things like notion of possibility, or alternatively, you mentioned the term explain. In my experience, when broadly speaking naturalists use the term explain, they often, I'm not saying they always do, but they often assume an interventionist notion of explanation. So when I see, I'm sure you've read Richard Dawkins, right? When Richard Dawkins says, when Richard Dawkins says God doesn't explain anything, he is assuming a notion of explanation that is interventionist. You say, we can't fiddle with God and make something downstream of God happen. This strikes me as a notion of explanation that is fundamentally at odds with what I take, what seems to be what most theists mean when they say explain something. They tend to be appealing to something like metaphysical grounding, like almost in this kind of Thomist sense. One thing that's be interesting to discuss with you is just how far a lot of these disagreements about fine-tuning and various other philosophical arguments for and against God seem to rest on both sides starting in quite different places and then unsurprisingly ending up in quite different places. Because so often it seems to me that these disagreements cash out at much more foundational disagreements about key terms almost, not to get all like, I sound like such a stereotypical guy who's done who's kind of studied analytic philosophy. It's like, it's all linguistic disputes. And I don't think that, but I do think that there are prior concerns that often go unaddressed.
I agree with you. I think you have to do a lot of foundational work before you get to the kind of like recognizable fine-tuning specific issues. Like, what is possibility? What is an explanation? Unless you and your interlocutor agree on those things, then you can advance further. But we often do not. Between a theist and a naturalist, there's a lot dividing the two. So I'm undecided on some of those bigger questions. So I think we can have a fruitful conversation about it. I mean, when it comes to explanation, it's not clear to me that the advocate of this argument need commit to one analysis of explanation over another. Because I think that while I did use that terminology and kind of cashing the fine-tuning argument out as an inference to the best explanation, I think that's more just a useful approximation to a more precise version of the argument, which would be to situate it in Bayes' theorem. And even then, you can appeal to a more specific item within Bayesian epistemology, the likelihood principle, which just says that if one hypothesis makes a piece of data that we have more likely than another hypothesis, then that data point is some evidence for the first hypothesis over the second. And I think we implicitly appeal to that all the time when we engage in explanation theoretic behavior. But you can appeal to that principle and utilize it, even if you don't really know how to cash out explanation. So long as theism makes a fine-tuned universe more likely than does naturalism, then, given that commonsensical likelihood principle, fine-tuning will be evidence for theism over naturalism. These kind of nuanced issues involving explanation notwithstanding. I mean, what do you think of that?
Yeah, no, I was more talking about more generally in terms of how theists and non-theists tend to use the word explain. I don't think much of that hinges on fine-tuning. I think the notion of possibility probably comes into it significantly more. Because again, to take because it seems like, fine-tuning arguments generally, there's an obvious kind of variable hanging in there, which is that to what extent do these constants freely vary? And, one way you can take this is the kind of, I associate it with Hume, I suppose. This kind of idea of we can't do very much possibility reasoning about universes themselves. We can only do possibility reasoning within universes. Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, you've got, well, I think the other hand is potentially a less pertinent issue, maybe because of Philip Goff has done some work on this, where you just kind of narrow down to a kind of more a finite range of values. But the other one is to say something like, well, not only, for any given constant, it can vary. It can vary much more widely than we might initially think, including, for example, one of your I think a very interesting argument you've made is this idea that in terms of justifying the fine-tuning argument, you need to get at something that God might plausibly value. And one of the things that God might plausibly value is human life. Right. And one potential thing of like, oh, well, we could throw this out more widely is to say something like, okay, well, whatever God values, is there enough of it? Would be one direction which you can take that. The other one would be, are there many, many other ways that God could achieve this value thing? So like, could the laws of physics be suspended as relevance to life, if that makes sense? If we're assuming that God has using a quite a broad definition of omnipotence. Could God, for example, who cares about the laws of physics? God can create non-physical life and stuff like that. Would be one other way of like, so you can kind of take the possibilities in two different directions there. I think for me, it is about finding and defending philosophically a range of possibilities that kind of are slightly stronger than simple non-contradiction, which I don't think I don't know. Yes. I don't know if non-contradiction can bear the weight we want it to. But at the same time, isn't just like we can't appeal to physical possibility, because then we've narrowed down too much, because then we've got to hold the laws themselves fixed. And we
Okay.
can kind of talk about the notion of metaphysical possibility and stuff like
Yeah.
that. But I suppose for me, it's having some kind of positive notion of possibility that you can then hang your probability distribution on.
Yes.
And for me, that's where like the epistemological issues start to become, or start to raise their head at least.
Yes. No, those are important questions that I have no firm views on. I mean, I've often thought, do advocates of this argument, do they mean physical possibility or do they mean metaphysical possibility? So to just say a brief word about the distinction. So like something is logically possible if it's not contradictory. There's probably a more precise way to say it, but that's possibility in the broadest possible sense. In a more narrow sense, in the narrowest of the three, you might talk about physical possibility. Something is physically possible if it's consistent with the laws of physics. And clearly things can be logically possible that aren't physically possible in this sense. An object traveling faster than the speed of light. If we accept standard physical theories, that's logically possible, but it's not physically possible. In between those two would be metaphysical possibility, which is a really rough and ready notion that nobody's defined very clearly for me, but it refers to like things that are really or actually like things that are actualizable. So the idea is that it might be the case that something could, a claim or a proposition could be free of contradiction, but it's still not really possible for it to be the case. And so to give one example that William Lane Craig always gives, and it's controversial and I don't agree with it, is that something's popping into being out of nothing doesn't involve a contradiction. But he would say, no, this is still metaphysically impossible. It's not actualizable. It's not possible in a strong sense of the word, even though there's no contradiction in it obtaining. So then the question is, in the case of fine-tuning, whatever you think of the specific examples, when we say that the range of possible values for these constants and parameters, when we talk about that range of possible values, what do we mean? Do we mean metaphysically possible? Do we mean physically possible? Okay, so this is just what I think from reading the literature. I think what proponents of the argument mean is that that the constants can vary in the sense that it's physically possible that they take on other values. And I'd be interested to hear what your objections are to that in more length. But I mean, initially that seems plausible because the way the fine-tuning argument is usually framed, you do take the mathematical form of the laws of nature as fixed. And you take the standard models of cosmology and particle physics, you take those as fixed. And then what you allow to vary is the values of these free parameters. And I don't think that involves any sort of like, well, if you take physics as fixed, wouldn't that entail the values for the constants? No, because these are called free parameters rather than fixed parameters, because current physical theory doesn't entail a value for them. Now, of course, you might say some future theory of physics or the true theory would, but the fact does remain that current physics doesn't give us a way to derive the values for these constants from any deeper principle. So I do think you can at least get an intelligible notion of physical possibility. Whether it's false or true is a different question, but it does seem to me like intelligible. It's you're not going to get the values fixed or entailed if you take the physics as background or as given.
Yes, sorry, as in I think we were just kind of using physical possibility in slightly different ways. Oh, I just meant like physical possibility as in we can't have it so narrow that the constants are fixed.
I agree. Right.
Obviously. Like as in the kind of trivially so. I suppose then we've got this kind of two different ways of kind of almost forming the notion of possibility downstream from here, right? So we've got a kind of scope. And then it seems like, the notion of possibility that's often appealed to when it comes to the fine-tuning argument is sort of consistency with, right? Like it could have been this, when we say physically possible, like it could have been this way in as much as it does not contradict our best understanding of physics.
Yes.
That it could have been this way.
Sure.
Like as in it's a negatively defined notion of possibility.
Yes.
The reason, we're talking earlier about how much I think that when I was younger, I think that I thought formalism was the answer to everything in philosophy, and now I think it may have just broken my brain. Is that when we're within things like modal logic, when you're kind of constructing a model, it's very much a picture of sort of you obviously you construct models by adding comprehension principles where something is there if it's non-contradictory. But at least the kind of image that it gives is that you're kind of adding possibilities in. Like possibility is a thing that needs to be established, right? And it strikes me that when I see people disagree about the fine-tuning arguments, oftentimes this is another prior disagreement they have, right? You know, that kind of idea of like, oh, if it's not fixed by anything, it is a possibility. Like the kind of the negative sense of possibility in terms of model relative non-contradiction implies this metaphysically heavyweight notion of can actually vary. And it strikes me that I kind of go back and forth on this because I am sometimes I am a bit of a realist about modality.
Okay.
And sometimes I'm not, and that kind of that very much dictates how convincing I find the fine-tuning argument in any given moment. But then just kind of analyzing the disagreement.
This is a new term for me. What does a non-realist about modality think? Like, what does that mean?
Oh, well, they just tend so like as in I'm thinking about an extreme realist about modality would be something like David Lewis, right? Concrete modal realism. Every single possible world actually exists.
Right. Okay.
And real, as we understand it, is an indexical term that refers to where the world I happen to be at. So we would call our world real. Someone else would call their world real. I think that if you're a concrete modal realist, and there are, I think, surprisingly decent arguments in favor of it that I think are potentially worth exploring, partly for reasons of it gets you into an interesting situation whereby discussing the relevance of the principle of parsimony to metaphysical debates. I think that we can be potentially a bit more ontologically bullish when it comes to metaphysics than we can when it comes to naturalistic studies, because it strikes me that the principle of parsimony is a pragmatic thing within our study of linear causality, and maybe we can allow ourselves to be a bit more free and creative when we're talking about metaphysics. But where was I? Yes, so and kind of a non-realist or anti-realist about modality. Obviously, things vary quite considerably, but we'll quite often cash out possibility as a classic one might be cashing out possibility as a kind of agent-relative thing. So possibility as a tool with which we use to examine and reason within the world. But there's nothing metaphysically heavyweight about that, right? So there, I might talk about the possibility of me going to the shops later, and by that I just mean that. I'm attempting to make a decision and I am imagining me going to the shops later. And that kind of, it's a much more, oftentimes, though not always, there are different anti-realist conceptions of modality. That's a classic style of anti-realist conception of modality. And the reason that I think that to a certain extent, this may have quite a lot of input on how different people take the fine-tuning argument is that if you're a realist about modality, the fine-tuning argument, I think, is significantly more persuasive, right? Because you have this notion of possibility just going into the discussion is already metaphysically heavyweight. And like you can raise an epistemic issue of like, oh, I don't know what the probability distribution is. But at the very least, you have the metaphysical implications of the argument already baked in once, like even in the terms, right? For somebody who's an anti-realist about modality, that it doesn't necessarily have that connection, right? Because an anti-realist about modality can say something like, well, modality is a human pragmatic notion, right? It's a perfectly sound, not in the strict sense, but it's a perfectly reasonable tool to go about our day-to-day lives, and a perfectly reasonable tool to go and talk about predicting phenomena, because we don't know what's happening necessarily in the future. But nonetheless, all of these intra-universe tools can't just be supplanted into inter-universe reasoning. Might be one way that an anti-realist about modality would then apply that to fine-tuning. But then you've got to be an anti-realist about modality, right? That entails its own, that has its own philosophical trade-offs.
Right.
And sorry, go on.
No. I've honestly never heard of this view before, and so off the top of my head. Off the cuff, it strikes me as very radical, I mean, maybe it's not. I mean, and so help me understand it more. But like that, I guess I interpret it to mean that like talk of what's possible, what's impossible, that's purely a human construct. Like there's no actual objective facts about what's possible or impossible. Is that the idea?
Well, listen. So one, I think that a lot of people are almost implicitly anti-realist about possibility without necessarily realizing it. And again, you think that could be a good thing, that could be a bad thing. I am I am incredibly undecided about realisms, about modality. But one thing that, for example, if you're a determinist, right, and you think that there is only one way the world could be,
Yes.
or that that you're there, or like just a kind of a naturalist and a kind of one universe naturalist. This is the world. Like there is no other sense of possibility in terms of like real possible worlds. Then you kind of would end up having to be at least leaning towards anti-realist about modality. You might have to go that it wouldn't assign you to a particular anti-realism, but nonetheless you would end up with you certainly couldn't take a kind of Lewisian view, right? And some of the more extreme modal realist views might not be as available to you. But having said that, I want to be clear that just because you're an anti-realist about modality doesn't mean you can't use this much more modest Carnapian model relative notion of possibility, which is where you simply do mean X is consistent with my model. That's all it means for something to be possible. And that's fine. But again, it's an open question how much you can metaphysically hang on that. But if you're anti-realist about modality, chances are that's not going to be the kind of thing that keeps you up at night.
Yeah, I guess I would have initially thought that like the determinist most of the time wouldn't be this kind of heavyweight anti-realist about modality. They would just say that, in fact, there's only one physically possible state of affairs for any given moment of time, and that it's physically impossible for things to deviate from the way they actually happen. But they might still affirm like metaphysical possibility. They might say there were a whole range of metaphysically possible initial conditions which could have led to different states of affairs. But then I suppose they might mean we can still cash out, even within this deterministic universe, a kind of lightweight talk of possibility, which serves our interests well, maybe.
That's what I mean. I think that that's kind of what I was getting at in that at the very least, if you're a determinist, you have to be non-realist about your everyday talk of modality, right? Like even if if you're a determinist, when you say I might go to the shops later, you can't mean that it's physically possible for you to and not to. Right? That can't be what you mean. Right, you have to be appealing to something else.
That's fair. Okay. And so then you could get more extreme versions of the view by by expanding that kind of pragmatic talk about possibility to physical possibility to metaphysical possibility, and because I think
even logical possibility. There's a guy called Francisco Berto who works at, well, he used to work at the University of St Andrews. He may have moved on since I last encountered him, but
yes.
He'd written a whole book with another guy who I can't remember the name of. I'm terribly sorry. Called Impossible Worlds, about about kind of our usage of impossible world reasoning. And part of their argument there is, we is that the utility of impossible world reasoning, ways that things could not be, and assigning properties to ways that things could not be, can be used as a kind of as an argument for if you're going to be realist about possible. Well, this isn't exactly what Francisco Berto says. Quite a lot of the book is kind of quite formal, but if you're going to use kind of pragmatic to realist reasoning about possible worlds, you can arguably do pragmatic to realist reasoning about impossible worlds. And if you're taking up this model theoretic notion of possibility, it's much more lightweight notion of possibility, then in theory you can create, you can just set your axioms as paraconsistent axioms as opposed to consistent ones. One area you might think that impossible worlds might be very useful are things like studying belief or studying knowledge, because if we know that people sometimes believe contradictions, and so one of the ways that you can talk about impossible worlds there as well. If you're modeling knowledge, this within the context of epistemic logic, if you're modeling knowledge as in a kind of modal theoretic sense, you probably will want to at some point introduce some notion of impossible worlds to account for fallibility in that way. So that's one kind of sketch argument you could have for at least the formal utility of impossible worlds. And then, quite a lot of arguments for modal realism are go from utility to, in almost this kind of Quine Putnam-esque way, go from we need it to it exists in a kind of realist sense. Or at the very least, the other thing is, of course, when I say that someone it might be an anti-realist about modality, of course, in this lightweight sense, they're a realist about modality, as in they can make true and false statements about what's possible. It's just that their notion of possibility is much thinner than other people's notions of possibility, if that makes sense. God, the word possibility is now lost all meaning to me.
I know. I think here's my philosopher's gut instinct that's quite untutored, but I'm going to run with it until I actually look into it, is I'm comfortable taking talk about possibility and impossibility as kind of conceptual bedrock. Like, we know what we mean when we talk about it, unless there is a specific objection to its use in a particular context. And that's going to be good enough for a conversation about within physics, within metaphysics, is this possible, is this impossible? Unless there's a really powerful argument against that. Often there's going to be concepts which are conceptually bedrock, and yet we still know what they mean despite having an inadequate analysis of it. Like, I guess I think of the instance of justified true belief as cashing out knowledge. It is not actually adequate in all cases. There are counterexamples to it, but like as Graham Oppy has said, it's an approximately true definition or analysis of the term. And so we have this kind of pre-theoretic understanding of what certain concepts mean, and that's good enough. That's not always a good response, and maybe it's not good here, but I just think you don't need a fully fleshed out theory of possibility in order to have coherent talk about whether it's possible the constants could vary or whether it's possible that God exists. We kind of like know what we mean. I don't know about that response, but
I think that it's I mean, I might agree with you in some sense. I do suspect that possibility might be approaching conceptual bedrock, just because possibility style reasoning is both ubiquitous and really hard to explain. It's just like it's just one of those, like, really irritatingly, it's like the law of non-contradiction. How are you going to get by? Well, Gray and Priest decide. How are you going to get by without the law of non-contradiction? But nonetheless, what else are you going to do, even if you can't quite point to exactly what's grounding it, other than I don't know how to think without it. But again, maybe Graham Priest will solve all of this, and maybe I suppose maybe he already has. Depending on who you ask, the reason why I think that that's one reason why I agree we might be reaching conceptual or getting close to conceptual bedrock. The reason why I think it matters for the sake of the fine-tuning argument is that I think that the disagreements about possibility genuinely do cash out in disagreements about the fine-tuning argument. So when a non-theist says something like, we've only observed one world, and we don't therefore know whether the constants can vary in any metaphysically heavyweight sense, they're effectively saying, without implicitly, they're saying non-contradiction isn't sufficient for metaphysical possibility, or even in any kind of possibility that you want to hang a kind of ontological inference on. And that's a substantial disagreement. I don't know how you resolve it. Don't get me wrong. Like, this is what I mean when I say that I think that often disagreements about arguments concerning the existence of God are often downstream of other things, at least in kind of popular sphere, as far as I can tell. Because that strikes me as a big reason why non-theists and theists disagree about the fine-tuning argument. And it doesn't strike me that that's very easily resolvable, right? I mean, you must, and the other I suppose the other response that I think intuitively you could have towards this, zooming in a bit towards this idea of we don't know how the universe's constants could have varied. That's a thing that we cannot verify, cannot have evidence about, is maybe to lean into, or maybe to, I suppose one thing you could do is construct an argument that would lead you to a sort of unacceptable level of frequentism in your approach of probability. Yes. That would be how I would respond to it, I think, because and then you could bring in all of the kind of standard anti-frequentist arguments, one-off probabilistic events, that kind of thing. There are, and also one of the, which I think is, I obviously talked about in the popular sphere, but it's a great argument about frequentism, is what's your relevant notion of similarity when you're picking your frequentist probability set. Probability is such a weird notion. I feel like, again, we use it all the time. It's very, very strange.
Yeah, I think that my response to that would be that, it probably would destroy like most scientific reasoning about large scale physical theories. Like when scientists discuss, especially in a Bayesian context, they discuss the likelihood of certain observations given general relativity or given inflationary cosmology. They talk about a model of the universe's development, and they say, what is the prior probability of this specific model? Okay, we apply a probability distribution over a certain class of possible models. And then they might say that what is the likelihood of certain observations given this specific model? None of that is grounded in different physical universes where inflation varies. All of that is just what you might call the epistemic probabilities involved. Like you can cash that out in a few different ways, but one is like, what is the reasonable degree of belief that we ought to ascribe to certain observations given this model? I think a better way of cashing it out is degrees of evidential support between propositions. I like Klemenhaga's characterization of epistemic probability. So we might say, what is the probability of A given B? Well, it's what is the degree of evidential support between A and B? Given A, how much support does that lend to B? None of those notions rely upon actual physical frequencies or actual physical universes where inflation differs and develops in different ways, and then we count up the number of ways a certain observation happens, and that's the likelihood. No. And so I don't know, if the bar is so high that it has to be that possibility talk and probabilities have to be grounded in actual physical outcomes and frequencies, then there's no ability to reason about large scale theories of the universe itself. Right?
Yes, no, I think that is like obviously a very powerful argument against frequentism. I think that it's interesting, the large scale theories thing. I to be honest, I don't know much about it. I am myself not really a frequentist. I kind of for largely for that reason. I mean, the other classic one that I think people use for the fine tuning argument is that idea of like, well, imagine that tomorrow we saw the first line of the Gospel of John, written in the stars or something like that. That there's only one way the stars have ever been. So how are we going to use that as evidence for God? A really interesting response to that, which I've kind of toyed around with, and I'm not entirely sure how convinced by it I am, would be to say something like, well, the kind of the thing that's varying there, or the thing that we know can vary there, isn't the stars themselves. It's human language. If the Gospel of John was spelt out in English or Aramaic or what have you, we know that those languages can vary. So the miracle wouldn't be the stars. It would be the fact that we ended up speaking a language that spelt out something in the stars. Which I don't know, that's an interesting way to kind of get. But I think the issue around large-scale theories of the universe, I think remains. I know that people have responded to it, but I'm not familiar with frequentist literature all that much.
I think I don't normally, these days anyway, appeal to the awesome theistic evidence cases, because the main issue will be that in those kind of inferences, you can take a lot of things as background information, which would then allow you to kind of ground a probability or a likelihood given theism, given a brute fact about where the stars align. Whereas in the case of fine tuning, like your background information is really, really sparse. You delete anything that would entail that life exists. Because if you have in the background, which is held consistent from hypothesis to hypothesis, if you have something in there that entails life exists, well, then the probability of a fine-tuned universe given any hypothesis is just going to be 1. And that destroys any ability to reason evidentially. But I'm sure there are further iterations of the dialectic about frequentism. But then I guess we can press forward. Okay, so if it's not a frequentist objection, where's the problem in talking about probabilities or possibilities in this context?
I think that I think that one way is to just attempt to save some kind of frequentist or just generally empirical grounding, right? The objection here seems to be what I think is the objection that the most people reach to, and intuitively when I'm in my more skeptical moods, will reach to about fine tuning is this idea of like, what's the justification for establishing the low probability of the low probability of life existing given naturalism.
Right.
I think that's the thing that I see most people taking issue with, and in my more perhaps just in my more radically or potentially even irresponsibly empiricist moments, that's where I tend to think, but how do I know? I've got this idea, this very minimal idea of, there's nothing saying that it doesn't vary. But surely then it seems to me that I ought to be quite agnostic about it. And maybe that's one reason why I am quite agnostic about a great many things. But particularly when it comes to things like, can the physical constants of the universe vary? That's what I see most people reach for, and also what I myself tend to reach for. And because again, something I go back and forth on, because I think that it's an open question whether that does just collapse back into frequentism. Because, then you have to talk about, okay, well, what about, we're saying like, how do we know that it co-varies beyond this? How do we know that it varies beyond this simple? It wouldn't contradict anything that it varies.
Right.
And is that just frequentism in disguise? Am I just saying the only way to establish that it does vary is to see it? Like, isn't that, I don't know. For me, it's like, so I mean, where I'm caught is that I intuitively, and it could just be that I'm massively wrong here and there are massive problems with my views. That happens a lot. So is that it seems to me like non-contradiction doesn't seem like enough to get to actual variance, or like heavyweight variance, or whatever you want to call it. At the same time, the arguments that I want to reach for against the existence of heavyweight variance, I recognize I'm just kind of making that up as a term, but the kind of variance that you would want to hang a metaphysical argument on.
Sure.
Also doesn't seem that arguments against it are particularly strong. Or they may well just collapse back into frequentism. And at the very least, I don't think that I want to say, or at least it would be a philosophical cost to say that in order to reject or in order to question the fine-tuning argument, you have to be a hardcore frequentist. That frequentism is not the hottest kid on the block in terms of interpretations of probability theory.
No.
So like that would be a pretty heavy cost.
Yeah.
So I don't know. This is why I've ended up quite agnostic about the fine-tuning argument, is because I can't quite see where the simple non-contradiction, thin notion of possibility we're appealing to gets us to the premises that we need to ground the argument and to ground that probability of any given set of constants given naturalism. But at the same time, I don't think the arguments against it are particularly strong either. So I don't know. This is why this is where I've ended up with fine tuning. Is this sort of deeply agnostic position?
Yes.
So I know I don't know whether you have anything to say about the bridge between that thinner, non-contradictory notion of possibility and getting to something thick enough to hang something metaphysically heavyweight on it.
Right.
So I'm sure there must be arguments for that, right? People have argued for everything. So
I know, right? I'm like, there has to be. Well, okay, so you're pinpointing an area in need of further refinement and development in my own understanding of the argument, because we're at very similar places in our evaluation of the argument and where we have pause. I don't know. Because I've often thought this as well. If you read like William Lane Craig's expositions of the arguments, he says, surely it's possible that, the value of the temperature or the density fluctuations, mass energy density, surely that's possible. It could have varied. But implicitly what he means is like, obviously there's no contradiction in it, and maybe even
that's what I mean.
says,
It just seems
it's too thin. I completely agree with you. So I think there are two separate issues one might have here. And I think it's important to fetter them apart, which is that on the one hand, it's important that you might say, you might ask, how do we know the constants can vary? Okay, that's a good question. How do we know it's really possible in some robust enough sense for these constants and parameters to vary? But on the other hand, you might say, okay, even if they can vary, how do we know that the probability of a constant being life permitting is actually small given naturalism? I mean, obviously, there are situations possible. There are coherent situations where even if the constants can vary, maybe they land in the life-permitting region 90% of the time. Oh no, Joe's gone.
Yes. Sorry about that. I don't know what happened there.
Thought you rage quit. You're like, fuck this.
No, not at all.
Okay, where was I in my beautiful exposition? Right. So yeah, we have these two separate issues where like, how do we know they can vary? And even if we know they can vary in some robust sense, how do we know that the life permitting region is, or how do we know that the probability of fine tuning, given it being a brute fact, given it being given naturalism, how do we know that it's actually a small probability? And so I think there's a lot of issues answering that first question. I don't have a good answer for you about the bridge between this, mere logical consistency or logical possibility and a more a heavier and more relevant sense of possibility. I might want to advocate something like a presumption of like real possibility, unless we have a reason not to think that it qualifies as such. That's kind of a more liberal approach to it, but that might be what I say off the cuff.
So my best bet when I've tried to solve this, because I'm quite a reluctant agnostic. I quite like to believe in God. So like I spend a lot of time attempting to have a crack at these from my quite naive perspective. Is that okay, let's say is to say something like, does the notion of possibility as coherence that we're appealing to when we talk about the fine-tuning argument,
yes,
is the justification that we use for that the same as justification we use when we talk about pragmatic possibilities in the world? And if those two things are continuous, then maybe we can if not argue for this notion of, or argue for this bridge directly. We could say something like, if you don't admit the bridge here, you can't admit the bridge here. And I that's just kind of a sketch. I don't quite know exactly what that argument would end up looking like. You know much more about it than me. Maybe this would be, you can have a go. But I mean, because that for me is like is what I think could really hit the non-theist where it hurts here, is to say something like, okay, if you disallow that bridge, you also have to disallow this bridge. And this bridge is so useful to you in pragmatic reasoning that you can't possibly let it go. Would be like,
I see, yes.
Which I suppose is similar to your like, assume that it's that there is a bridge unless you have some special reason not to, like a presumption argument. I think kind of, kind of the same ilk. You're kind of saying you're making this presumption here. Why don't you?
It would
be
unjustified not to extend it in this circumstance.
Yeah, that's
unless you want to avoid theism, and then it's just question begging. So maybe that's what I would say.
Yeah. I don't know, man. Like I'm kind of we're so far into the weeds now that I'm struggling to keep all of the propositions straight in my head. But that would be my best bet. Like I also, this is partly just a bias thing. I'm fascinated by philosophical arguments that are like that aren't necessarily trying to prove something, but are saying these two things stand or fall together. Yes. I think they're great. Like I don't know, maybe it's just their rhetorical appeal that I enjoy. But I love it when someone says, but if you don't have this, then you also don't have this, or like just. But maybe it's just because it has a kind of pleasant structuralist feel about it. You know, you're kind of you're already in the boat of your model, kind of drawing out connections while you're already in it. I think because of course everyone has to every philosophical map of the world has to start somewhere, right? You know, we're not building the boat on the docks. We're building the boat as it's sailing. You know, this is, and replacing assumptions here and there. And I have kind of two concerns about this that are relevant to the non-theism theism debate. One is that at some point the non-theist and theist end up on entirely different boats. And so there just there ends up being no plank on which they agree, which, ordinarily fine, right? People end up with totally different sets of beliefs, such that even their method of reevaluating the beliefs is so different from one another that they struggle to find common ground. Like, fine, whatever, man. But like the fact that when it comes to theism, one of the reasons why I find the theism debate so interesting is because it's one of the, I would argue, maybe few cases in the literature where, like, abstract metaphysics is of importance to the linear causal chain of your life, right? You're going to die, and then you're going to wake up somewhere or not, and like you can't run from it. I guess in a bit, maybe other people can. I can't run from it. So this is why I find it so fascinating. But that's the reason why this kind of. The idea of two conformational holist pictures of belief sets getting so far apart from one another that they can no longer talk is so worrying in the case of theism, is
Yes.
because plausibly immortality or lack thereof rests on this. And like, we need to pick the right boat. Like, I find this often with, like scholastic arguments for the existence of God and people working within this sort of the kind of well, not pre-theoretic in the technical sense, but like unexamined or naive pre-existing assumptions of the kind of mechanistic Galilean worldview. This is another example of where people end up in such different camps, even at their base level, that they struggle to talk to one another. And I don't know. I don't know whether that's that's a voice break and a half. I don't know whether whether that's what's happening in most or even many cases with the non-theist and theist debate. But I suspect that it might be happening in at least some.
Yes.
And I don't know, that worries me, right? Partly because maybe this is just naive of me, but I still care about the question of whether God actually exists.
Yes.
And getting like, and this seems to throw into doubt the sense that we can move forward practically with that, and I find that very worrying. As I kind of look more and more at different arguments between theists and non-theists, I increasingly get the sense that they're living in completely different philosophical universes, and even their stances for what counts as a good argument or a bad argument seem almost totally divorced from one another.
Yes. So I think that essentially that situation does obtain some of the time, but I think it obtains not because there is a fundamental and complete lack of conceptual overlap between theist and atheist, but because a few levels higher, there are participants in the conversation who refuse to question certain assumptions. They just are either psychologically incapable or they are completely unwilling to question those assumptions. So like, how is that different? Well, I suspect, I haven't spelled this out formally, but I suspect that if you really press that like the theist and the atheist are in two completely non-overlapping, conceptually distinct like universes of discourse, you're probably going to end up being self-refuting. You're probably going to end up being in a self-contradictory set of claims, because you will at once be saying that these two positions are entirely non-overlapping conceptually, but yet asserting that from a place outside the two, or from a place of commonality between them. And so it ends up just being self-refuting. I don't know, but that's my hunch. No,
and I don't necessarily mean they have no overlap, but just that it becomes increasingly divorced from one another. Like, a classic example of this is when someone says something like, an argument is not evidence. This is something I see a lot, and something that I obviously disagree with, but it's something that I see a lot from non-theist people. And my tender response to that is to say something like, well, evidence is only good when you put it in some kind of reasoning chain. Otherwise, it's just there. I don't even know what to do with it. But like that's like an example of a disagreement about fundamentally what it takes to even evaluate a claim or an argument.
Yes.
And like my again, I'm not necessarily saying they live in completely different conceptual worlds. I'm more suggesting that as you say, these disagreements at higher conceptual levels are really important, and often influence. I think one of the reasons why non-theism and theist conversations often end up kind of slightly fruitless is because I don't think we have a good idea of where the disagreement is coming from.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, okay. So I agree with you entirely. I guess I was just objecting to the potential like postmodern critique here that we're all kind of like.
Oh yeah,
trapped
sorry,
in our
no, I
narrative
probably.
But I totally agree with you that like the level of overlap between participants in the debate will vary, and oftentimes will be very, very sparse. And so to really make advance and have a fruitful conversation and really advance the dialectic, you have to go very, very deep to the foundations. So you're no longer, as you said, you're no longer talking about fine tuning or about God or about probability distributions. You're talking about what it even means for something to be possible, what it even means for something to be an argument. And I think you can, and philosophers do engage in that conversation, but you don't get that in like a televised debate,
exactly,
or
right? I mean,
at those levels of interaction.
I mean, even the Copleston-Russell debate.
Yeah.
So even in that, they immediately bump up against different notions of necessity and analyticity. It's like the first thing they talk about is like, you have a contingency argument given by Copleston, says there must be a necessary thing. Russell says, I don't even know what you mean by that. Like, necessity is truth by definition.
Right.
And like that, these are like two of the brightest people of their age.
Right.
Kind of still, and immediately the debate about God is a debate about necessity.
Right.
I sort of think that, it's very, very strange to say. Sometimes I think that the conversations about God ought not to be about God at all. They ought to be about necessity and possibility and things. And then maybe somewhere down the line we'll get to God. But the trouble is that, debates about God are not, they're interesting, to us as abstracts, propositional webs. But that's not how most people are engaging with God and with religion. There's a much greater urgency in terms of answers with the question of God than most other metaphysical questions, right? So somebody might say, take the debate between the A, B, and C theories of time, right? Like somebody can very easily say, oh, well, this really depends on your notion of causation, or like, thin and thick notions of existence about whether, the A theory, is it the A theory of time or the B theory of time that ought to be contradictory? I always confuse them. The A theory of time, whereby you might end up in a contradiction, but you might not. People are very happy to say, okay, well, this relies on this, and we can chart the chain of deductive dependence back to where the disagreement arises.
Yes.
And that's all well and good for most metaphysics, but like theology or philosophy of religion is practical metaphysics. As much as such a thing exists.
I'm glad you
I think
feel that way. Not everybody does.
Partly I have partly this is just a kind of intuitive, like, thrash, because I at the same time as having quite a generally skeptical view of the fruitfulness of metaphysical discussion, I nonetheless cannot not care about the existence of God. I just can't.
Yes.
I don't know whether. So to that extent, it's like I'm staring the pragmatic importance of the question of God in the face a lot more than I am the question of A, B, and C theories of time, or like universals and particulars and stuff like that. I just sort of think, fine. I can look at debates like that and go, oh yeah, fine. Like, I guess if you have these intuitions, you end up believing in a very thick notion of universals. If these intuitions, you end up a very thin notion of universals.
Yes.
But God is very different. It's why I think that people are captured by debates around the existence of God. Partly because religion is such a big sociological phenomenon, but also because when people talk about God, it bridges the gap between, noumena and us. Most people, a lot of people, especially now, kind of, well, we're 2 centuries post Kant. Most people are quite happy to say, I find with almost any issue of noumena, are quite happy to say, I don't know, man, like, doesn't matter to me. But God bridges this gap.
Yes.
He suggests that at some point you're going to have to come face to face with noumena. I think that's why. That's why I think that that despite the fact that in other debates, I think people are quite happy to do this charting back process and seeing where the origin of disagreement lies. You can do that with theism. I think that just people tend to be much more reluctant to, because like it matters. Like as in it matters in a very day-to-day basis.
I completely agree with you. And yet, there is a strong contingent of people that I talk to every day in the UK, for instance, who, even if they might have views, maybe they are atheistic in the sense they believe God doesn't exist, or agnostic, they don't know. A lot of these people express serious, I should have gotten the word before, apathy. I was thinking antipathy, and that's not the right word. Apathy about God's existence or lack thereof, or religion, its truth or not. They just don't care. And I think that attitude is fundamentally mistaken. It's based on a naivete about like what results if these things are true. But I mean, let's talk about it. What are the? Let's pretend I'm apathetic, Joe. I'm not, but let's say I am. What? I think it just doesn't matter whether these things are true, and we probably can't know anyway. What matters is the here and now and how we live our life. And besides that, if there's something after death, well, then I'll find out then. What about that, Joe?
Well, I think that, for one thing, it's like the one of the interesting things about God is that he intervenes as a thesis at both the level of hierarchical causality, but also very much at the level of linear causality, right? Like, it's all very well saying, oh, I don't care what happens after I die. But, like, I don't know, man. Unless you think that the question is totally epistemically intractable, and you might. I actually don't think that. Right. I think that, for example, I think that I think, for example, we can talk about things like the contingency argument and stuff like that, and the plausibility of different premises and stuff. And with fine tuning, right? I don't think fine tuning is like a totally fruitless argument. I say it's something that I go back and forth on. So at the very least, I think I'm committed to the idea that you can make rational evaluations of. You can make progress towards conclusions on the God debate. So but that would be the only thing that I'd say is that if somebody is totally apathetic, I feel like a lot of the time that comes from the idea that you cannot move forward with this.
Yes.
Like it is epistemically intractable. And my response to that would be that I don't think it is. And
Right.
I think that a lot of the time, well, because most people, I think, secretly don't think that it's epistemically intractable in principle, because when you bring up something like the problem of evil, most people are quite happy to say that lowers their credence in the existence of God. But then it's not epistemically intractable, right? Something can't just be tractable in one way. Well,
Right.
I mean, maybe it can. So there's a philosophy for everything, but I think that would be something you'd be hard pressed to argue for. So, I think that. Say, looking at I don't know, something like psychophysical harmony, right? If you're going to that is like that could plausibly raise your credence in the existence of God, and if it doesn't, you have to bite certain bullets, right? It's not just a matter of like, oh, I can wave my hand and it's gone. You have to lean into a kind of deeply human-centric, phenomenal view of inquiry, and that's fine. I'm more happy with that than most people are. But like the not caring about God on the basis that it's like epistemically intractable, I think is often I don't say cop out because I don't like to accuse people of copping out of things, but I think that it is often. I don't think people often mean that. I think that it's often just like a nice thing to say, And also, I think people are. I don't know. It's very easy to ignore the question of God in the moment, but like I don't know, mate. I feel like at some point your mind will turn to the concept of eternity, right? Like I don't know. I mean, that's part of what I think about things. The other thing is that clearly when let's move away from the God of the philosophers for a second. You can clearly have evidence for and against certain religious claims, right? Like whether Jesus rose from the dead that's not a metaphysical claim at all. That's a historical claim, with a foot in metaphysics. It doesn't strike me that there's anything epistemically intractable in principle. Say tomorrow we uncovered a barrel of letters from, thousands of people in and around Jerusalem who couldn't have talked to one another or collaborate on anything, and they're totally verified, saying that, yeah, there was this guy and he died and he came back and was wandering around talking to people, we actually found the first-hand accounts of all of the 500 people that were said to, surely that would raise your credence in the existence of God, right? Like I don't know. Maybe this is the naive of me, and there are very good objections as to why it wouldn't. But at the very least, it seems to me that seems like it would be the case. From my relatively naive perspective. So I don't know. I think that a lot of the time it's just psychological. Like people find it very, very easy to ignore because it's not immediately of issue. But I think it really, at some point it's going to be of issue. If you're, we all die at some point, and also, it's. I know. I mean, obviously, you can't rationally argue somebody into caring about something. But I do think that a lot of the like total apathy around the question of God's existence is a matter of habit rather than a matter of reason. It's like, oh, well, I haven't thought about it for a while. My parents might not believe in God. My friends might not believe in God. The question just isn't live. It's partly also because I think that, I think this is kind of insulated, or this kind of self-insulation process occurs whereby the God or theistic belief ceases to become a hypothesis and just becomes like an object of mockery. The reason, and people have made all kinds of criticisms about that it's just rude. And yeah, it is rude. But more importantly, it's epistemically blinding, right? Like it is non-reasonably enacting something that lowers your credence in a hypothesis, your subjective credence in that hypothesis, And that's an epistemically not sound thing to do, which is why we talked about the fine-tuning argument earlier, and we ended up sort of at a bit of an impasse. But it wasn't like the impasse wasn't that, oh, and therefore God is ridiculous. The impasse was that we've got this like unsolved, or we've got this like seemingly difficult problem in the fine-tuning argument, and we've also not got a great response from the non-theistic side if that bridge can be bridged. That's not like that is the conclusion of that argument. That like when you're in the weeds of it, it's very hard to argue that theism is totally ridiculous. It's only when you stand back and think and kind of treat it separate from any of the arguments for it that it becomes like, oh, this seems really silly, right? Like there's an old man on a cloud, la-di-da-di-da. Like it's very easy to lampoon it, but it's very easy to lampoon lots of things, right? Like, imagine, like, I always like to use the example of, imagine if somebody like introduced you to formal logic and they were just like, hey man, like, yeah, we draw these like squiggles on the whiteboard and then like, we like find out that actually pure arithmetic is incomplete. And it's like, yeah, okay, you can make it seem ridiculous, but it's not ridiculous, right? Like, just because you say something in a silly voice doesn't actually mean that it's silly. You can say anything in a silly voice,
So true.
But so yeah, I don't know. I think that accounts for a lot of the like actual, like the people actually not taking the proposition of God seriously at all. But I think once you I think it's very difficult to not take it at least partly seriously when you're in the weeds of it. I think the other thing is that by the time that an argument for the existence of God filters down into like public discussion, it's sort of 3 or 4 steps caricatured from as it's actually given.
Mm-hmm.
If you compare a paper on the fine-tuning argument, or like the divine hiddenness problem is another. I really like the divine hiddenness problem. I think it's soluble, but I really like it. I just think it's really interesting. And but if you compare a paper on that versus what happens when you get down, when you see a atheist versus theist debate, or the problem of evil is another one. It's sort of 4 or 5 steps removed from the arguments as they appear in the literature.
Right.
And I think this really gives people the impression that papers arguing for theism are just silly, but they're not. It's just that you've got like 3 steps of guy wearing Donald Duck costume away from the actual argument. Like, I mean, probably is actually probably the best example of this, right? Because like something like an argument like, we are imperfect beings and thus we should not expect to be automatically reconciled with a perfect being, gets transformed 4 or 5 steps down the line to whoever's suffering deserves it, which of course isn't what that means. That's not the same thing. And moreover, like the person whose suffering deserves it is in at least the Bible is an argument that's explicitly rejected by the Book of Job. So it's not like this. I mean, as in things get very, very twisted and caricatured, and I think that's why. I think that's why you end up with this. And to be fair, I think it does happen on the. It probably happens on the theist side as well. I'm just obviously more familiar with the atheist side of things.
Sure.
But it really gets caricatured on the atheist side. I think that's a shame. Partly because I kind of just want people to get the most sophisticated versions of arguments. I think that's good. You're more likely to come to the correct conclusion if you have those. But also because I think it leads to this kind of situation where it's very difficult for non-theists and theists to talk to one another. I think on the theist side, this has its own caricatures, but they just tend to be better known. Like, the caricature of like, oh, well, your granddad's a monkey or something.
I was going to say,
like people know that that's a caricature, right? Like whereas people don't know that we live in a fallen world is the kind of, or we are imperfect beings and thus we should not expect to be in automatic relationship with a perfect being. A lot of people don't necessarily know that that's what people are getting at with that kind of defense of the existence of, or that kind of defense against the problem of evil. I think genuinely the popular understanding of it is whatever bad thing happens to someone, they deserve it. And I think that is like, I think the misconceptions are probably more popular there. But then again, I have a skewed sample, right? Because partly because the UK is not a very theist country, but also because obviously I spend my time talking to non-theists.
I agree with essentially everything you've said, that these issues are important, and I think all reflective people would eventually acknowledge that in some measure these things impinge on your life and affect the way you feel day to day, depending on what you think about ultimate reality, purpose, value, meaning in life, the reality or lack thereof of an afterlife. Obviously, those things matter. But there will be unreflective people who do not immediately see the importance and they don't care to think further. And to those people, I don't really have anything to say, and I don't think anything needs to be said. Like, for me, I think these things are important, and I think it's pretty clear that those who disagree are mistaken. And the conversation is happening. There are plenty of people discussing this in journals of philosophy and online and in popular culture. And, you know, if there are others who don't want to participate, all right, that's okay. The conversation will carry on. So that is my kind of response to truly incorrigibly apathetic people is, okay, you know, I'll leave you to it. You're missing out.
I suppose to a certain extent, like, you can't force people to care about things. It's very difficult to even tell why we care about things. You know, there are certain things that appeal to us, certain things that don't appeal to us. Something that I've been increasingly interested in actually has been a lot of, like, within something that I noticed, you know, reflecting on the kind of popular theism, non-theism questions, we do often sort of, we oscillate. Well, there are kind of, it's almost like there are two positions on the table. One of which is, you know, non-theism, so either a lack of belief in God or a positive belief that there's not a God.
Right.
And full omnipotent, omnipresent, omnibenevolent, personal, and intelligible, which I think is something that often goes unsaid, but I think is really important. God, on the other hand. And stuff I've become increasingly interested in are sort of intermediate positions between the two. So, for example, you know, we talk a lot about the idea of, you know, naturalism, and in that we tend to, well, I know you don't, because you've written a paper on this, but the rest of us tend to kind of pretty much equate methodological naturalism and substance naturalism. Whereas, you know, there are non-physicalist methodological naturalists out there. Brian Leiter argues that Nietzsche's one of these, but, you know, that's controversial. Like everything in Nietzsche scholarship is controversial. But I always think of something like the Quine-Putnam indispensability argument for, you know, why a naturalist might want to believe in non-physical Platonist mathematical objects as like a prime example of where it's not, you know, I think that methodological naturalism is probably, at least for me, the stronger, not stronger in the sense of says more, stronger in the sense of more supported version of naturalism out there. And I think we ought to, you know, take relatively seriously, at the very least, we ought not to dismiss out of hand the idea that there might be methodologically naturalist arguments for non-physical objects, or indeed, you know, loosely, or you know, non-physical accounts of consciousness, right? Like Galen Strawson gave that argument that's kind of very naturalist in spirit for panpsychism, where he says, if we can't reduce it to anything and we obviously can't get rid of it, what do we do about consciousness? Oh, well, we just say it's there. Like, you know, it is continuous with our reality. And then under that view, the kind of mind-matter divide crumbles. But that's not, you know, people see that and think, okay, that's very wooey. And people see things like the Quine-Putnam indispensability argument and say, oh, actually, maybe they don't see the Quine-Putnam indispensability argument, but they should, and think, oh, you know, that's all a bit wooey. We end up with Platonism about mathematical objects. But I think we should take seriously the idea that there's nothing inherent in the commitment of methodological naturalism that rules out, like a priori, that we could end up with something that is methodologically naturalist but not substance naturalist. And I think to a certain extent that opens up quite a lot of interesting middle ground, right, between the kind of hardcore materialist position and the total, you know, hardcore theist position, for want of a better term.
So what do we mean by methodological naturalism in this context?
So when I'm thinking about a kind of very, very a very weak or minimal form of methodological naturalism, which would just be, you know, a kind of a bit of empiricism and then a bias towards certain correlative theses like explanatory I forgot the name, explanatory interventionism, and a loose empiricism, but not a totally committed conspiracy, empiricism, and this idea from I like Quine, I think, is a good example of the kind of methodological naturalist I mean, where philosophy is continuous with science,
Yes.
but nonetheless it's not, but that continuity runs both ways, right? Like you can't by fiat say that science is therefore materialist, like by definition. That has to be something that falls out of the process. This kind of process first investigative philosophy. But then again, you can question about the plausibility of things. Again, talked about, I think mentioned Philip Goff either earlier or before we started. He's posed this idea of a limited God, which, historically is a reasonably popular thesis before the idea of, before kind of the God of the philosophers, as it's classically known, arose. I don't know. I think some of these intermediate stages could I suppose my worry is that I think some of these intermediate stages, things like being incorporating elements of Platonism into your philosophy, or limited gods, or panpsychism's probably in there as well. I think a lot of the time they've been ruled out for historically contingent reasons as opposed to philosophically rigorous reasons. I mean, another one might be something like I don't know if Manichaeanism is the right word, but some form of Zoroastra tinged dualist theism, right, where you've got a good deity and a not good deity, and the kind of two opposing forces. It's not that necessarily I kind of think that any of these are true. It's more that I think that we, because of historically contingent reasons, I think we don't often appreciate just how much gradation there is between materialism and classical theism, and that actually there's like a lot, there's a whole spectrum of views in between. If you're the idea of being a non-materialist atheist is fine. Arguably materialism and atheism aren't even that closely connected. I mean, no, I don't want to say that Hume is an atheist. I know that's a point of contention, but at the very least, a bit of an agnostic. And Hume, is he might be called a materialist just because he looks a bit like a materialist, but he's ultimately a phenomenalist, right? He's dealing with perceptions. He says he's quite skeptical about what the metaphysical stuff of the world is made out of. I'm very keen to pry apart some of the views that we bind together, not for any necessarily philosophical or logical reason, but just the fact that we often find them in the same basket. You know what I mean?
Yes. I think what you're pointing to is a real fundamental weakness with the way the fine-tuning argument is usually presented in the very minimalist form that I gave it, where at the end of the day, you're just comparing two very specific hypotheses against one another and saying that fine-tuning should lead you to think that one is more plausible than the other. And it's the hypothesis that you outlined of robust theism, the all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good, personal God, compared against what you might usually call brute fact naturalism. The natural world is all there is, and the constants have their values as a brute fact or just randomly by chance. And the conclusion that fine-tuning supports robust theism over that specific hypothesis, that's a very modest claim, because that only gains significance if you can compare it to every other conceptual possibility. And obviously, there's far more possible hypotheses, possible ways reality could be, than just those two very specific theses. And you've outlined two of them. I mean, the limited God, you might have the application of panpsychism to the universe, what Philip Goff calls cosmopsychism, the idea that the universe itself is a conscious agent and fine-tuned its constants for life, and a whole host of others. I mean, I actually have a paper under review right now where I look at 4 non-theistic, non-naturalistic explanations for fine-tuning in the exact effort to begin to chart some of that landscape between these two very specific alternatives that we've kind of limited ourselves to in the conversation. So here, I totally agree with you.
Yeah, I think specifically, I often think about like Platonism about mathematics as a real. I think that there are good arguments for and against it, but I do think that this Quine-Putnam indispensability argument ought to be taken seriously, and I think that kind of, and if so, I think that can kind of open the door for a bit more of this idea that materialism and atheism aren't the same thing. They can be pried apart. arguably atheism is a much more, it's a very least, more trivial, I suppose. It's much more difficult to defend if you tap theism onto tap materialism onto it, because it's just a larger statement. But at the very least, we ought not to, as you say, we ought not to just limit ourselves to, brute fact materialism and robust theism. I mean,
yes,
it's something that I know you've written on, and I'm kind of loosely interested in. Things like kind of more, not necessarily full-blown skeptical theism, but the idea of gods that you can know more or less about. Because one thing that, an immediate internal tension that's always fascinated me about theism, partly because I use it a lot to defend theism from the problem of evil and divine hiddenness. Because my standard response to that has always been kind of the Book of Job response, which is to say that, if you're a human, you are suffering, or God hasn't revealed himself to you. That's me. God hasn't revealed himself to me. So, and you're sitting there going, oh, I wonder why this is. And the obvious response is just like, what do you know? There's this being of kind of limitless, infinite potential. There is a limitless mind. And how would you expect to know exactly what type of reasoning he would use, and how would you ever be justified in saying that you could reason better? That seems to be silly. The image I always use is, I was in my dad's garden one day, and I had a kind of copy of the complete works of Shakespeare open, because I was learning a play at the time, and an ant crawled across it. And I remember thinking, that's the perfect image for solving the problem of evil. Like, it's just an ant crawling across Shakespeare. Like, not only wouldn't you know, you couldn't even conceive of the kind of questions that you would need to ask in order to solve the problem of evil, because they're probably far beyond you. And the tension within that, which you've written about more recently, is that the less intelligible you make God, the less easily things like the fine-tuning argument and other kinds of, classically natural theology style arguments go. Like, even if you accept God exists, that's arguably only the beginning of study, right? Kind of then what's God like? And a classic way to do that is to look at the natural world. And if you make God too transcendent, that becomes much more difficult. I mean, like, I'd be interested, because you know much more about it than me, and you've thought much more about it than me. Do you think there's a good middle ground between these two positions? Because I struggle with, when I'm trying to conceive of a notion of God, not to end up either too far in the intelligible camp or too far in the unintelligible camp.
Yeah. No, I do not have a good resolution for you, but I, too, find antecedently plausible both this, like, skeptical theistic stress upon the utter transcendence of God, the infinite intellect relative to our finite intellects, as a response to evil and divine hiddenness. Like, we couldn't, the ant analogy is perfect. Like, the ant couldn't make any sort of inferences about why this ginormous figure above him was doing what he was doing. It just doesn't even have anything close to the correct or enough of the conceptual apparatus required to understand why a human being is doing what they're doing. Well, all the more between, like, a human and God. Okay, I think that's plausible on its face. But then I also think the fine-tuning argument is plausible. But, like, without something more very, very sophisticated or nuanced or detailed said, how are we to argue that God would likely create a fine-tuned universe? Because that seems to be the exact same kind of inference we just said that we can't make. Who are we to judge the ways of God, to predict what they would likely do or what would be a good reason for them? And where I fall these days is to accept that I've got a problem of evil on my hands and that we can say something about what God would do, because I still find that skeptical theistic point quite plausible on its face. It's just that, like, Philip Goff has really forced me to grapple with this objection to skeptical theism, that it seems to lead to extremely counterintuitive or even, like, absurd consequences. That, like, the same reasons you give for this epistemic humility or inability to judge what God would do with respect to evil, that seems to imply that, like, no matter how extreme or extravagant or plenteous the evil and suffering we encounter is, we would never have any reason to think there is no God. We could find ourselves in a seemingly eternal hell of whatever imaginable level of horror that we allow ourselves. And the skeptical theistic arguments would seem to apply with equal force. That who are we to say that there's no perfectly loving God running the show? That seems wrong to me. that seems like a mistaken implication.
It is. I think that I actually think that almost beyond that, like if you're a proper skeptical theist, to a certain extent, like attributes like God is loving. Like, what does that even mean? Like, what does that mean anymore? That's because I get that, it's a well-worn scriptural interpretive path to say that, with these attributes loving, these are anthropomorphizing things that aren't quite like it. But it's like,
then what does it mean?
Even if they're analogous, like even they have to be analogous enough, right? Like you know, I can start talking about I can start talking about this. I don't even know what this is. I can start talking about this as like a square.
Is it a coaster?
And it's not quite a square. I think so. It's something came. Oh, it's a microfiber cleaning cloth for my
Naturally.
camera. Shows how much I clean my camera. So this I can call this a square, and you kind of know what I mean, even though it's not a square. It's obviously not a perfect square, but it's also got these little nooks in it, and that makes sense. But I can't start calling like this a square. Like it's not. The analogy doesn't even hold. A lot of we need some kind of similarity relationship there. Of course, the advantage for the kind of the person who might be inclined towards non-theism but might find themselves convinced by non-fine-tuning arguments the existence of God, things like Aquinas's ways and stuff like that, is that they can say something like, okay, yeah, I've got my being that grounds things, and I don't, and like that's it, like that's filled the gap in my ontology. Fine, like I can't say anymore because he's so much greater than me, but it's solved my problem. And I think to some people, I very briefly held that position. I was like, right, okay, and now I kind of I suspect that it wouldn't necessarily do all the things that I would want it to do. But I'm still fascinated by skeptical theism as an idea, or at the very least, more skeptical theism. Because obviously it's a gradation. A gradation of skepticism you can have. Obviously, there will be presumably a point along that line whereby God is intelligible enough, but also transcendent enough. But finding a principled argument for where exactly that is going to be quite difficult.
Yes, that's what we want. We can't just arbitrarily draw the lines in an ad hoc way so that we save ourselves from falsification in the face of evil. I mean, obviously in that paper, I offer one version of skeptical theism, which I contend after very, very careful and lengthy back and forth in the dialectic, you can show that this argument does give you what you need in the face of evil to remove its evidential sting or disconfirmation, but it still lets you argue for fine-tuning. My trouble is I'm not sure I think that might be right, but I'm not sure that argument, that version of skeptical theism succeeds in the first place. So even if it's compatible with fine-tuning reasoning, I'm not sure it gives you what you want with respect to evil. I don't think it actually works in the end, or it might not. So then, but then that leaves me as a theist. I go, well, then what am I going to do about evil? If I can't offer these epistemic humility considerations, then I'd have to see. It seems that I would then be obligated to say that evil is some evidence against God. But the trouble is that, like, the reality. I'm not sure. I'm thinking out loud here, Joe, so you can help me assess. But
that's what I've been thinking out loud this whole time. So
But it seems to me that, like, the reality of evil is far more pervasive and apparent and in your face than fine-tuning or empirical indications of a beginning of the universe, or even like the implications of moral realism or whatever datum you want to say weighs in favor of God's existence. The reality of evil is huge and plenteous and ubiquitous throughout human history. So if you contend that a specific instance of evil is some evidence for God's existence, then the total cumulative weight of evil throughout all of human history across the world, how are you going to avoid the conclusion that it's just overwhelming evidence against theism, no matter what degree of plausibility you ascribe to theistic arguments? It's just always going to be outweighed by evil and suffering. And so I find it difficult to avoid the conclusion that it's you either fall in one of two extremes. Either evil is no evidence against God, we agree with the skeptical theistic critique, or it's completely overwhelming evidence for atheism that cannot be outweighed by any other consideration. That's what I'm worried about.
I think that there are a couple of things that that leap out to me. One is to go back to that. If we can find a very, very solid bridge between the notion of the kind of negative and positive notions of possibility we were talking about earlier, then I think plausibly the sheer extent of the unlikelihood that you could then establish of the constants under naturalism would then give you, I think, pretty good reason. So that I think you could say something like, let's say for the sake of argument we've crossed this bridge. Then I would say that's a comparatively strong argument in favor of the existence of God. The other thing I suppose would be, the other thing which you do both is just let go of the idea that God's all loving. Would be, because then God can be very intelligent enough to design the universe, and yet not be all loving, at least not in the sense that we tend to think. I suppose a third one would be that you could appeal to heaven. Like one of my friends is an Orthodox Christian, and he says the problem of evil doesn't matter to him because he's a universalist. He knows everything about Gregory of Nyssa, and
right.
And that's his solution. He just says, doesn't matter, go to heaven. Everything's going to be outweighed by that. I think that's one approach. Although, as my Catholic friend is fond of pointing out at the pub, my Orthodox friend is also a heretic. So, who knows? You can imagine what pub conversations are like. I'd say another option would be to say something like, let's not think of God as, let's think of God as, and where there's also its own form of heresy, but as something analogous to a hyper-intelligent human. So, think about like Kurt Gödel, right? Kurt Gödel is so much cleverer than me, as evidenced by the fact that even his most simple proofs took me forever to get my head around. And
that's fair.
And he just shot them off in his early 20s because he's a bastard. And so like something like that, right? Kurt Gödel is not totally unintelligible to me, but he's also not. Also, if Kurt Gödel made a decision in constructing a logical proof, it probably would not be immediately obvious to me why he'd done that. And also, it might take an awful lot of explaining on his part to get me to understand why he's done that. Or like another one is like von Neumann, right? Von Neumann is so clever. Almost like incomprehensibly so, almost. And like, so I suppose one thing is to lean into the anthropomorphization of God and say, God is just he's not so clever that we could never understand his reasoning, but he's also not. But he's also not like we'd really struggle to understand it. It would be
right.
It would be like similar to a kind of 3-year-old to an adult rather than an ant to a human.
Yes.
Of course, I was discussing this actually the other day with my Orthodox friend, and one thing he did point out is that this does seem to, in some sense, place a limit on God, and he wasn't happy with that. So I think there are solutions, but I think each one has its own trade-offs. Philip Goff's limited God, I think, would solve it. I suppose, actually, of course it would. Didn't he design the God? He designed his limited God to solve this, didn't he?
Right. That is his whole idea, is that the thesis of a limited God. Well, we can talk about that, too. His shtick is that the thesis of a limited God, also sometimes cashed out in the cosmopsychism way. He's a bit ambiguous on this point. But anyway, some sort of limited God can allow you to solve the problem of evil and fine-tuning, and hang on to the evidential significance of fine-tuning, because we just say that God is not all-powerful. He can't prevent the evil in the world, and so there's no similar evidential problem as if you say that God is perfectly good and all-powerful. Then you go, well, then why all this evil? But like, one issue is that it looks pretty ad hoc. Like, you get a God who's powerful enough to fine-tune the constants of nature, but then like can't alter the course of a plane heading towards the World Trade Center. It begins to look ad hoc in a way that's difficult to like nail down. That you'd have a God that powerful but not able to do these seemingly easier things. And so, and he's not supplied a lot of detail there. It's like, well, what's the fuller story here? How do you get without being enormously contrived, how do you get a God that can do these apparently fantastic things like set the constants and parameters of the universe in place, but can't prevent the evil and suffering in the world? So I think like evil would be less of a disconfirmation for the limited God, but I feel like it still would be pretty big.
Yeah, I suppose the other tension that I often find in arguments like I'm not stressing these are tensions within any one person. These are often given by different people. But another like really interesting tension in theistic arguments is the universe being designed seemingly for intelligibility, right? Like, we can understand what's going on relatively well. We can create laws. We can predict it. Why is the world not total chaos? It seems like that, like chaos is if anything kind of the norm.
Yes. Okay.
Certainly combinatorically, right? You throw any kind of sequence in a randomizer, you're going to get very little order.
Yes,
So,
okay.
And the world, but nonetheless, the world seems to be set up for the human mind to get a reasonably good grasp on it. You can argue about things like, can we get a good grasp of things like quantum theory? But like, and I think that genuinely could be like an empirical objection to this. But at the very least, we're pretty good at understanding the world, and the world behaves predictably. So that's one one argument I've seen people give for God. There's a kind of mind-world correspondence, just like kind of correlation almost. As you know, I will say correlation because that's slightly thinner than correspondence. But there's the mind and the world map onto one another quite nicely, in a way that seems very strange. But of course, one of the strongest arguments that's been given for that is the law-like nature of reality. And miracles runs directly counter to the law-like nature of reality, especially if you're, say, a Catholic. And miracles aren't necessarily that uncommon. If you look at the number of miracles that are recorded, it's I'm not saying it's an everyday occurrence, but I'm saying that it's not a once-in-a-generation occurrence or anything like that. It's something that you could reasonably expect to observe within your lifetime. And, people, so that's an interesting tension as well. How much is God intervening in the day-to-day workings of the world? If it's too much, then you lose this psychophysical harmony. Again, I don't know if I'm using the right word, but you lose this kind of law-like support for God. And if he's not, then you potentially lose some of the miracle side. And that ought not to be underestimated, I think, because I think miracles persuade a surprising number of people, especially if they've seen one. This is or if they've prayed and something has happened. I think a lot of people are, whether rightly or wrongly, a lot of people are very convinced by that kind of thing. But then that if God is the grounding for order, that becomes a bit more challenging. And also, miracles I think opens up a bigger problem for things like the problem of evil. I find the philosophical arguments about miracles very interesting because it seems like it both could be very helpful for theistic positions and also profoundly unhelpful. Because if God's intervening once to save someone's life, why is he not intervening elsewhere?
Yeah.
And if God is intervening and suspending the laws of nature at one point, then how are we to rely on these laws of nature in quite the way we want to? Are they merely probabilistic? But if that's true, it might be, then in what sense is God grounding the law-like nature of the world, the total or the kind of semi-predictable nature of the cosmos? So I don't know, or law-like, I should say. So no, it's interesting these kind of tensions that arise within theistic arguments. I kind of, and I suppose it's the very old problem of like how free is God? Is God constrained by constrained by himself? I'm not stressing, constrained by his own nature, and to what extent can God's will freely vary? Yeah, I don't know. I don't have a solution. I just think it's very interesting.
I've been thinking about that lately in a slightly different context, but it's this question of like, why should we not expect a miraculous universe if God exists? There's I won't get into the details, but there's an interesting like anti-fine-tuning argument from these authors Ikeda and Jeffries, published in 2006, where they claim that actually the discovery of fine-tuning disconfirms theism, because theism, by various probabilistic reasonings, leads you to think or predicts that we ought to find ourselves in a non-fine-tuned universe, but one in which we are miraculously sustained in being by God. And so the fact that we
I think
don't
I have
observe
come
that,
across this. Is this the one where we're all souls in the void and stuff like that?
Yeah, and so the idea is like the fact then that we do exist in a universe where life is naturally possible is actually disconfirming of theism. Now, I ultimately reject that argument because it seems to me that exactly what you're saying, that like there are a lot of goods that come from having a universe of consistent laws of nature that are open and transparent to scientific discovery. And that wouldn't be possible in a universe of constant miraculous intervention where the underlying natural order is opaque to us. So then you ask, okay, so does that mean that like, if we then say that theism makes it likely we find ourselves in an orderly, natural, and structured, law-like world, does that mean that miracles disconfirm theism? And I think off the top of my head, I would say that you can't immediately say, yes, it does, because the probabilities involved will always be comparative to the other hypotheses in question. So I think it's possible to say that theism makes it decently likely we'd find ourselves in this orderly, natural universe where life is naturally possible with laws of nature and order and all that. But then you might say, okay, those same considerations will mean it's not super likely we would expect God to intervene miraculously for all those same reasons. But nevertheless, a specific miracle would be extremely unlikely, far more unlikely given any of the non-theistic alternatives. In which case, at the end of the day, when you work out all the numbers, you don't get disconfirmation from miracles. You get confirmation. I'm not sure that's all probabilistically coherent, but that's kind of what I'm thinking, that it all has to be comparative. And so like if you could show that Jesus rose from the dead and it's a miracle, that fact might have a low likelihood, 1 in a billion, given theism, for the reasons we've indicated. We want consistency and order and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, if we put up the main competitors to theism in that context, Jesus' resurrection will be disastrously even more unlikely, and so we should still infer theism in the face of Jesus' rising from the dead. That might be one way to resolve that conflict.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, the other thing that the reason why I think miracles are a stronger argument for the kind of robust theism we've been talking about is that it strikes me that the law-like nature of the universe can be accounted for by all kinds of metaphysical hypotheses. Even if you're, even ruling out, if we've already ruled out naturalism for the sake of argument, you could be a Neoplatonist, you could be a Platonist. There are all sorts of things that account for law-like stuff. The reason I think that miracles are such an interesting argument for God is because they speak. If you prove a miracle, that, at least, on the face of it, appeals specifically to what I think is the most interesting part of the theistic hypothesis, which is the personality of God, like the agentic nature of God. I think that, because I think I think that's just by far the most interesting part of God, right? Like, surely that, maybe because it's the most philosophically necessarily unfamiliar bit, I think, maybe, in the sense that, Platonism is one of the oldest philosophies in the world. We're having Platonism doesn't seem like it's particularly, and also Platonic objects are causally inert. So they're not going to come back and designate you an afterlife. So, right. and kind of mere law-like nature seems like it can be accounted for through Platonic means. Whereas miracles, I think, are a very interesting arguments for God, purely because, in theory, they're very good arguments for agency. If you can show that one's happened, take like the miracle of the sun, right? If you can show beyond a shadow of a doubt that there was something distinctly unnatural that happened there, like beyond question, well then, not only does that speak to something non-naturalistic, it speaks to something non-naturalistic and agentic.
Right.
Be that God or be that, angels or be that the demiurge, if you're a Gnostic about things. But like the point is, it speaks to some kind of agency there because it seems like a decision has been made. And that's why I think miracles are very interesting. And I don't know, I don't know what you think about that, but that's what I'm thinking off the top of my head.
Yeah, I mean, like I find the thesis of like a personal ultimate reality to be far more, this undersells the point, but comforting than that of an impersonal ultimate reality, even if it's non-natural and otherwise interesting and metaphysically intriguing, because it feels like then the other subsidiary hypotheses, like life after death or objective meaning for life, are far higher on this view in which the ultimate reality has a personal foundation. Like, I think that goes hand in hand with this idea that ultimate reality is loving. You can't really say that on a, say, Platonic view where, love is an abstract object. Fundamentally, it's an ideal, but the abstract object love is not loving. And so if ultimate reality is like perfectly good, all loving, I mean, I think that takes care of a lot of existential worries. And so for me, even as someone who's largely agnostic outside of kind of minimal theistic commitments, that's the shape that my theism is going to take for largely, and this is something I want to ask you about. We'll segue into this point. For largely pragmatic reasons. Like, if you pinned me down and said, Miles, what's your evidence for this view that ultimate reality is a personal loving being that's powerful enough and in control of the universe enough to direct the affairs of each individual life to an ultimately good end? That's ultimately how I'd encapsulate what I think. What is your evidence for that? I am not going to be able to give you a sufficient list of publicly verifiable evidence that would then issue in the conclusion that this thesis is more likely than not. Rather, one of the answers I would give is that believing this makes life better here and now than not believing it. And that provides, for me, sufficient pragmatic justification for believing it in the absence of strong reasons to think that it's false. I don't know what you think of that. What do you think of that, Joe?
I think that, I suppose it touches upon a really interesting area of thought, which is just the question of, can you, normatively, should you believe something on reasons other than its truth? And
yes,
most people hear that and say, absolutely not. But to really steel man this point, we do have all sorts of ways that we evaluate beliefs that aren't necessarily to do with truth. So we can open the door a crack here. So one is like parsimony in science, right? Parsimony, try to explain as much as you can with as little as you can. Is like, when I think about that, I kind of think, well, there's no a priori reason to think that's like going to be more true. Why couldn't it be that actually reality at ground level is more complicated than the simplest theory we could come up with to explain and predict it? Like, could that not be the case? I mean, I don't, unless we're really leaning into anti-realism and saying something like, well, yeah, because, our way of explaining the world is human relative, la-di-da, which is fine. Like, I don't say that. I actually am quite sympathetic to that point of view. But if we're in realist world for the time being, I don't see any reason why it would be the case that necessarily this metaphysical world is going to cohere to constraints of parsimony. Right. And nonetheless, even scientific realists tend to admit that even if this doesn't bring you closer to the truth, it is a reason to believe in the more parsimonious theory. So you could try and make an analogous argument to that, I suppose. I suppose an open question to whether it would work. I mean, obviously, the most famous person that's argued for something like this kind of existential or emotionally pragmatic reason to believe is William James in Varieties of Religious Experience, where he talks about the idea of like, well, if you need God, then go and believe in him. But I mean, I don't think that James is doing much. I don't think James means that point to be like philosophically heavyweight. I don't think he means believe it and it is true. I think it just means like, he's ultimately a psychologist at heart, James. He's very, although he's now, a giant of philosophical pragmatism. I think it's important to note that James himself is a psychologist, and is making that point in a lecture on varieties of religious experience. It's very experientially coded, or it's coded, experientially embedded, and so no. I mean, the one thing is to I suppose there are a couple of routes you go down. One is to say like try and stop me. As if you can believe and you want to believe. Like, here I am, Joe. And the and the important, and the interesting thing is that if we're talking about a proposition for which you don't have confirmation of it, but you also don't have disconfirmation. It's not butting up against experience, but it's not actively being confirmed each and every moment by experience, right? So one, So you could make an argument that, okay, this seems like the thing about which people could rationally or reasonably choose either way. There's not much constraining your decision here. Because, I just think, because I feel like a lot of the time when people make arguments against choosing belief, and that's, I think very strong arguments against kind of radical choice in belief, is to say something like, well, it's not, if you choose to believe something that butts up against something that you then experience, you just cannot continue believing in it, right? Like I can't believe that my desk is made of aluminium when it's not. It's just like I can't do that. But if you're not at this very moment being confronted with disconfirmatory evidence, and also there's not overwhelming confirmatory evidence such that you are compelled to believe that by your observations, which are just forced upon you, then yeah, I suppose you could come up with an argument for, oh, okay, yeah, I choose to believe this, and it's not strictly irrational and it's not strictly rational either. It's just an extra thing that I'm tacking onto it. But in I think that at the very least, that type of belief would be worthy of a slightly different name. At the very least, a little subscript. People, I love it when philosophers do little subscripts of words. So I think this would be worthy of a subscript. Of course, that whole argument relies on the idea that it's not being actively disconfirmed. So the problem of evil, for example, would be something that you would have had to have already put to bed. Because the problem of evil is an argument against the existence of an all-loving God.
Right.
It doesn't follow from destroying it that you would then have an argument for an all-loving God. So if you had this kind of this point where there is it's on a coin's edge, or it's kind of it's a flip of a coin as far as you know, then I suppose that you could choose to believe it. In the set, like on a pragmatic level, in the sense that it's not going to butt up against your experience, and I don't really know on a moral level. I mean, I kind of don't. I'm not really sure. I'm sure there'll be some people who will argue that there is just a duty to believe what is true, or that it's and I think a duty to only believe that which you have evidential support for, and not simply not evidential unsupport for. But I'm kind of, I don't have any kind of major problems with that. I think that generally I don't think your beliefs are up to you because of the kind of forced nature of experience. But if experience isn't telling you either way, then I don't see any reason why psychologically you wouldn't be able to eventually believe something. I think if I think that if I really put my mind to it, I could believe that. In the kind of unobservable metaphysical substrate of reality, all is water, or something like that. Thales. We're back to Thales. But I think I probably could believe that because I would never come up with anything to confirm or disconfirm it. And to that extent, I think if people find something metaphysically comforting, then that's okay. I mean, I suppose that, morally, I suppose it depends what you then do with it. But I mean, I kind of think that's in the world of do what you like epistemically, I guess. If it doesn't butt up against experience, it doesn't not butt up against experience. I mean, the flip side to this is that I could think this. Yeah, the flip side to the point I'm making here would be someone like Peirce, or even someone like a kind of neological positivist saying, and that shows that the proposition is contentless or doesn't matter. Or doesn't have literal significance, but only emotional significance, or something like that. So I know you can argue that either way. You can either take that as an endorsement or a condemnation, depending on what your initial starting points are.
Yeah, I think I agree with most of what you're saying. For most of our beliefs, they're not or are no longer within our control to determine whether or not we continue holding them or not. But let me give you a thought experiment to kind of like test intuitions about the relevance of pragmatic considerations. Like, let's say that you discovered that the universe and life were completely and utterly pointless, and you became convinced, or really we can specify, you figured out that the reality of our situation in the universe would immediately lead you to suicide, and that there was no rational ground to argue that is somehow the wrong response to this horrific reality that you're living in. And then let's say that someone gives you a red pill. I can't remember the red versus blue. But here's this pill in front of you, and this like in your existential state, and they say you can take this pill and you'll forget all of this, and you'll come to believe that actually there is meaning and purpose in life, and we're all headed towards a good end. I think there's a very real sense in which the rational thing to do is to take that pill. The rational period, not a qualified rationality, but the rational thing is to take that pill. I think that embedded in this like truth for its own sake is implicitly the assumption that the truth is worth knowing, that the truth is in some measure good.
Yeah.
And that if the truth...
I suppose this... Sorry, no, go on.
I was just going to say, and that if the truth is really bad or horrifying, we shouldn't pursue it.
Have you read much Nietzsche?
I haven't.
Only because it's similar to certain points that have been made about, certain interpretations have been made about Nietzsche. The idea that that truth, and what Nietzsche means by truth is its own horrifying interpretive issue, is totally separable from any idea of what it is good for a person to feel. There might be illusions that are necessary to make life livable, at least for a certain proportion of the population. That's kind of one of his points. And it's interesting. One of the... I think that on the whole, we inherit a lot of assumptions from kind of really ancient belief systems that kind of go unquestioned quite a lot of the time. And one of the reasons I think Nietzsche is very interesting is he questions a lot of them. And one of them is truth. Kind of truth is virtue is happiness. Is like a kind of an idea, to be good will lead to your flourishing, and truth is good. It's in the idea of human well-being and truth are intrinsically connected. I think that shows up everywhere. I think it shows up in actually a slightly polysemous way that we use the term rational. So you said it'd be rational to take that pill. I think that's because we actually have two senses of the word rationality there. One is, does it bring me closer to the truth? And another is it in my interests? And I think, if you are Plato or Aristotle, those two things just come together, because the idea of what is true and the idea of what is good for a human are so closely intertwined that you can't pry them apart. Yes. But we don't have that anymore. It's perfectly compatible with most modern philosophies. Maybe not. Maybe actually, some theistic philosophies are the exception to the rule here. But if you're a realist about the world, it should be perfectly possible for the world to be the truth about the world to be completely at odds with your livability.
Yes.
I don't know if that's a word, but your ability to live a good and fulfilling life.
Yes.
And I think that's we just butt up against a genuine inconsistency in our inherited value system there, whereby we're committed both to the kind of intrinsic value of truth, let's say, and our own interests at some level. And historically, those things have been assumed to be tied together very closely, and actually I don't think they are. I think that it would be certainly rational in this sense of in your own interest to take the pill. It wouldn't be rational in the sense of it wouldn't be bringing you closer to a complete set of true beliefs, but that's a very trivial sense of rationality in this case. It's kind of baked into our experiment that it wouldn't be that rational, that type of rational. So yeah, in terms of what you should do? Yeah,
that's the question, right?
I think it just reveals a genuine inconsistency in our inherited morality. I just think that we have both intuitions there.
Yes, we do.
Because of this historically inherited idea that true equals good equals happy. Or true equals good equals fulfilled might be a better word. And I just think that doesn't hold. And I think that realism is, I think, a far less easy idea than most people give it credit for. Like realism in and of itself.
Realism about?
Is just anything, right? Like if you think that realism about a thing entails that it can totally vary with regards to human interests. It can be anything, and it can be at odds with your human interests. It can be totally unintelligible. The ground nature of reality could totally be disconnected from your human perspective and understanding. That's not an overwhelmingly easy pill to swallow. I bring this up with moral realists sometimes, where I say under a moral realist framework, at least if you don't, some moral realist frameworks do fine with this, but under a kind of a naive moral realist framework, or just the idea that moral truths stand and fall independent from any kind of human mind. Just that opens up the possibility for somebody to go, that's good, and I don't care. Like, so that's which is insane, right? It seems like it should be constitutive of our morality that it's motivating, and yet, more like that kind of unadorned moral realism doesn't actually quite get you there, because in theory, what could be good to do could be totally at odds with human interest or human motivation or anything. It's kind of I don't know. There's probably somebody that's formulated this much better than I have, but I tend to call it the inertness problem of realism. And you can do this about the external world, because you can do this by saying, the external world could be totally unintelligible to us, and that follow that line of inquiry. You could do it with morality by saying, well, in this sense, morality could end up being totally not motivational to us. And it's like a fun line of inquiry to go down with regards to realism. And the one way of tying these two things back together is to appeal to theism. Like, I think that genuinely is one reason why, if you're a realist, you have at least some prima facie interest in maybe exploring theism, would be to try and tie what is actually metaphysically real back to the human, because God can bridge the gap by being a mind and designer of the universe.
Yes. Okay. So a lot of interesting things there. Let's talk about that moral realist view. That is my view. Yeah. Whatever you want to call it. It sometimes goes by the term robust moral realism, because there are views that go by the title moral realism that, like, those on the robust side would go, but that's not the point. You're missing. But it's this idea that, like, there are fundamental evaluative truths about what is good or bad, right and wrong, that can't be reduced to purely descriptive claims. Okay, cool. Okay, so then I'm curious about this point you're making. So what is the structure of the objection here, that, like, there could be these moral truths that are true and valid and binding independently of all human opinion, the way in which mathematical truths, presumably, are true objectively, independently of what people think. Even if everyone thought that 2 + 2 = 5, it would still be the case that 2 + 2 = 4. All right, so moral truths are like that. They exist just as objectively and robustly. Okay, so then what's the... continue from there and structure the issue.
Sorry. And to be clear, I do think there are solutions to this, and we can go through a few of them. I actually think that, one way of solving this, which I think potentially gets the best of both worlds regarding lots of moral realism, moral anti-realism, is to, like, borrow the positive story of emotivism, but not the negative story. So the kind of general idea is this, right? Like, imagine, presumably there are under mathematical Platonism, there could be mathematical truths that we just never discover, right? We just never, like, and moreover, like, mathematical truths that are totally irrelevant to our lives. Like, maths can't, the reason that 2 + 2 = 4 is, like, a mathematical truth, but also relevant to me, is that it's instantiated in the world around me.
Yes.
And if objects never came in pairs, as weird as that seems to say, 2 + 2 = 4 would exist as this, like, inert mathematical truth off in the realm of Plato.
Right.
The interesting kind of the analogous case for moral realism is to say something like, well, it could be that we are just under just that kind of robust moral realist view without a kind of epistemology tying us back to it, which is one of the things that I think theism can do very well. You can end up in this situation whereby either there might be innumerable moral truths that we don't have access to because they just never come up, or they just never come up in an epistemic sense, like they never make themselves known. Like, in theory, if there's total mind independence for moral truths, it could be that all tweezers have incredible amounts of moral value, and, like, that could be a fact that we could learn. And it seems like but nonetheless, it seems like a very inert fact. Like, would that actually change our behavior? And also, if we never learnt that, we could all be moral monsters and not realize it. My point is more that, like, total mind independence also comes with costs. One of the reasons why I think theism is such a strong thesis to pair with moral realism, because I used to not think that that there was, like, a problem at all for moral realism under atheism, and I do still think that you can have versions of it, but I've become more convinced that, like, the theist story is stronger. And the reason I think it's stronger is because it deals with this possible inertness issue. It provides epistemic access. God
Yes.
presumably has unmitigated access to objective moral truths, and also can communicate them to us. And in theory, could design us with moral intuitions that track moral truths, which is like something that, at least on a kind of realist view, could just not be the case. You know, it could be that there are objective moral truths, and they're just not tied to us in the same way that, like, I mean, suppose it's like to a certain extent, it's like kind of the noumena phenomena distinction from Kant, but applied to morality. You know, the kind of moral noumena is out there in some kind of inaccessible Platonic realm, and we've got this moral phenomena which just might not correspond. And theism, I think, is one way of solving that. And another way of solving it is to say that you can provide all sorts of stories, right? You can be a bit of is it Sidgwick who has just the kind of the perceptual account of moral truth? It might be, or you could adopt what I think is an interesting position, which is to tie your moral realist story to a positive part of an emotivist story, but not the negative parts. You have moral truths, but also there's like an inherently emotive component to the moral truths. And I don't know, I haven't really worked that out in detail at all, but I just think that would be kind of fun. Partly the thing that got me started on this was because I was reading Mere Christianity, and I noticed how often C.S. Lewis switches between kind of moral realist language about goodness and badness and emotive language about outrage and praise. And I think, I don't think, obviously, C.S. Lewis is a moral realist. There's also clearly an unalienable emotive component to how he conceives of reality. And I don't think these need to be in conflict at all. I think these can tie really nicely together. And I don't know, I think that, and, I'm 99.9% sure that people have probably worked that out in much more detail than I have. But I just think that it's kind of an interesting position because I don't often see it talked about.
I have a feeling I know what your response is going to be. But, why is that problem any more pressing for pressing for moral realism than it is for, like, external world realism? Like, because you could run a very parallel argument here and say, well, if you're going to claim that facts about the external world, the world outside our minds and perceptions, that if you're going to claim that there are objective facts about an external reality outside our minds, that it really exists out there, and even if all humans disappeared, there would still be a planet, there would still be a solar system, a universe of physical objects. Well, but that opens up the possibility that all of our sensory and perceptual beliefs are mistaken, and that the physical reality that actually obtains is vastly different than the way that we see it. And then you might cash this out with any of the skeptical scenarios of being a brain in a vat, or being deceived by an evil demon, or being stuck in the matrix, blah, blah, blah. The objection, the issue doesn't look as much of a problem.
Yeah, no, and for the record, I don't think it is a particularly pragmatic problem. Like, I think that I actually would just kind of bite the bullet there. I think quite a lot of people would, even if they don't necessarily think they would at first. I think that is, essentially that is like Kant's noumena phenomena point, right? Like this idea that, yeah, it could be that this world not filtered through our categories is totally different in or certainly like ungraspable in its raw form. But that doesn't mean it doesn't follow from that our experiences are mind controlled. Tasok Chang has this distinction between mind framed and mind controlled, and his argument is, well, experience is mind framed, but it's not mind controlled. I can't choose to experience the world in a certain way outside of very, limited situations. But that doesn't, and so there is still this sense, you still get a nice part of realism, which is that experience is forced upon you in whatever form it happens to come. And nonetheless, you still, you tie it closer to human experience. So I think quite a lot of people would just bite the bullet. I think genuinely it is a problem for any kind of realism. It's a fun problem. I don't think it's an insoluble problem. I also don't think that it's, I think a lot of people would just say it's not a problem, and that's fine. That's kind of, I just think it's interesting because I think that mind independence is often seen as costless, and I don't quite think it is. I think that it has costs, and those costs might be, like anti-realism has costs as well. You might be willing to pay those costs, but I just want to acknowledge that the costs are there because so often realism is taken to be this like, oh, well, we really do want realism, but we might have to make do with these other things. As I know, realism itself has things that you can question about it. And I just think we don't in kind of popular discussions, we don't often go for that. But that is the kind of response that has been given to realists in the past. I mean, it's like Peirce makes a relatively similar argument, not about moralism, but about kind of external world realism, because his point is like, well, we just don't access it. And more importantly, he thinks that we can make do with this forced experience model. And that might be true. It doesn't matter what I believe in the external world. It doesn't mean that the world I inhabit is up to me. I think that's kind of it's interesting how much of the real kind of repulsion towards a lot of anti-realist theories are either about world or about morality or about anything else hinge on this idea that if it's not totally mind independent, that means it's in like every way, that means it's up to me. It can vary with my choices, and it can vary infinitely between people. So, just because even if you're a moral anti-realist, that doesn't mean that morality can vary between people either. You can have a story about why morality doesn't vary as much between people as like you might initially expect. I think about this with beauty, right? Most people think that beauty is mind dependent in some way. You get vanishingly, in popular spheres at least, you get vanishingly few aesthetic realists. Right. That doesn't mean that I can like point at a dog turd on the street and be like, right, find this beautiful. Experience just doesn't work like that. It is not up to us, even when we concede that things totally are subjective. I mean, pain's totally subjective, but it's not up to me. It is something that someone else can inflict upon my world, and I can't do anything about it.
I mean, that's true. That's very true. I think that when it comes to aesthetic versus moral realism, I mean, there are obviously going to be widely different views that fall under the really big umbrella of like non-robust realism. And so, you might be a cultural relativist, you might be a subjectivist, you might be ethical naturalist. So you think these claims are just reducible to descriptive claims, like of the Sam Harris kind of type, where our claims about goodness, for instance, are really just scientific descriptive facts about what is conducive to human flourishing. And so you'd have to get specific to then ask, okay, what are the implications for the actual variability of morality and so on and so forth?
Yes, yeah. No, exactly. I mean, this really is, perhaps I should revise this. It really is sort of it's sort of an argument just against like total mind independent, almost Platonism about something. It's that kind of argument. It's more like it's more of just a thought exercise than anything else to kind of get across that there are costs, rather than a sort of, it's not like it's not a massively well worked through argument. And as you say, we can have all sorts of realist positions, both moral and non-moral realist positions, that fall short of this total disconnection. You have indirect realist views or adverbial realist views. You have all sorts of ways of bridging this gap. It's just interesting because it's more of a kind of an interesting thought exercise for, like I said, mind independence is often seen as just like an unalloyed good, but you can go too far in the mind independent direction as well. And I think that I find that interesting. Just as I have partly because I just have a fondness for neglected lines of argument. I just think it's kind of fun.
No, that's fair. Well, while I have you here, I did want to ask you a few, in decompressing from the intellectual heights we've been in, I have a few more like down to earth questions for you as a YouTuber, as someone engaged in philosophy. What is your primary motivation in this effort to, build this platform on YouTube, discussing philosophy, engaging in these conversations? Obviously, I do it too, so I'm not asking from a place of like, why are you doing this? I think there is good reason, but like, what motivates you in doing that?
I suppose from one perspective, I just think philosophy is really useful. And I know that's kind of a controversial thing to say, but I really do think it is. I think that it can get you thinking more clearly about things. It can. I think the kind of attitude of analytic philosophy I'm very passionate about, because I think that that emphasis on precision and defining things and getting into the weeds of something and just kind of tearing it apart, I really like that, and I think that it's incredibly helpful. Not just in philosophical pursuits but also elsewhere. The other thing is that philosophy is kind of has a very ivory tower reputation, and I think that that leads people to think that A, it's pointless, and B, it's like elitist, and I just don't think that's true. You know, I think that it's perfectly. I think philosophy is for everyone. That's very cheesy, but like I don't see any reason why it should be kind of gate kept behind the. I don't see any reason why it should be gate kept behind university gates. And there's also just kind of a more selfish reason, which is that it allows me the kind of luxury of being a bit more of a generalist about philosophy. You know, like when I was in university, you know, I kind of considered going into academia, or trying to go into academia, because I should say, because it's really bloody hard. And one of the things that I came up against was like, I don't know, I want to read really widely. Like I want to be able to, you know, I was thinking about applying for PhDs studying, you know, epistemic logic and stuff like that. And I thought, I really like epistemic logic. I think it's great. But is that what I want to spend all of my time doing? Is that, you know, so part of it's that's my kind of selfish motivation. It allows me to read much more widely than I would otherwise. Of course, that comes at the cost of depth. That's like, you know, like for instance, I can't do what you do, for instance, which is publish papers and things. I would produce not very high quality papers, because that's the kind of it's the you know, producing a high quality paper is on the other end of hard work, specializing in a particular thing, you know, as you well know. So I'd say it has costs and benefits to it. The other thing is that I really enjoy teaching. In fact, when this kind of YouTube thing blows over, as all social media success inevitably does, I'm going to train as a secondary school teacher and hopefully do a part-time PhD in something that I find very interesting, and sort of retreat into the bushes. I haven't decided what to do. I might apply to do it on pragmatism, like American pragmatism, kind of Pierce, James, and then over here people like Ramsey and arguably later Wittgenstein and stuff like that. I think that'd be really fun. Kind of philosophy of science stuff. And so I mean that's kind of that. I mean, that's my motivation. Is there's one foot in, I really believe in philosophy, in kind of making philosophy popular and giving people like starting points. Like I'm always very clear that my videos aren't like comprehensive. They're always like beginner's guides to things. So the idea is like, oh, hopefully this puts you in a good position to go out and explore the literature around this. You know, philosophy has fill papers. This is like the most amazing resource that nobody knows about. That most papers in the past 20 years you can find for free. Isn't that awesome? And kind of giving people a starting point to go and then search, go and conduct their own philosophical studies. I'm very passionate about. But also, yeah, it gives me the opportunity to do a lot of reading. About various different thinkers, and that's a real privilege. I really, really appreciate that, because it's genuinely a luxury.
That is how I feel about, I mean, pursuing this degree, getting funding to do a DPhil in philosophy. It is an utter privilege, because I am aware of the fact that it is not as immediately practically beneficial as, you know, going into machine learning or becoming a doctor or becoming a lawyer, where like you're very clearly and directly contributing to the common good. I think you still do, but it's more general and circuitous, and getting there takes more time, and seeing the impact, you got to go big picture. And I completely relate to that. I do think though, Joe, that like, I don't think this YouTube thing is going to blow over for you. I mean, you're about to hit 1 million subscribers. And so I think that the only way you're going to accomplish this dream of post YouTube is for you to say, I'm done with this. I don't think the people are going to leave you.
Oh, that's very kind. I mean, I don't try and put much stock in kind of social media success, just in sense, both in the sense of like, it's important not to plan one's life around it, because it can go.
That's true.
You know, like YouTube could adjust their algorithm tomorrow and suddenly nobody will be watching my videos. You know, it's just the kind of how things happen. But also, you know, I think that, like I also think that you know, people just fall off, right? And the other thing is that sometimes the alternative to falling off is becoming like captured by your audience. And I don't really want to do that either. You know, like I want to be able to explore different topics. Like I want to be able to explore the philosophy of science and stuff. And that entails putting out videos that I know fewer people will watch, but I think that's important. I think that loads of people become audience captured without realizing it, because like unconsciously almost they're like they're adjusting what they work on for algorithmic concerns because it feels good, right? It feels really good when a video does very well. But I think that's the thing that ought to be combated, because I think it's very easy. I think all of the natural pressures are on the way of becoming audience captured. I mean, one of the reasons why I put out far more videos criticizing kind of materialism, or the kind of this hardcore materialist atheism, than I do criticizing theism, is because I'm a non-theist. Most of my audience are non-theist. It's important not to just give people confirmation. it's so yeah, there's that aspect to it. But but I do really enjoy it. It's an awful lot of fun. And yeah, I think hopefully I'm hoping that my videos put people in a relatively good position if they then want to explore it further to do so. I'd hate for somebody to think that I've given them the final answer to philosophy. I think I start every video going like, I'm not, this is like a tiny flavor of what's out there. Go and explore the literature for yourself. It's really rewarding.
Did you expect things to take off in the way that they did, or were you like shocked by this level of success?
Oh, yeah, no, I did not at all. I was, very, very fortunate. I just sort of, I was making videos initially because I was tutoring a couple of kids, and one of them said, I'm having a bit of difficulty like with a few things, and I'm also having difficulty remembering what we do, and remembering what we've covered in the lesson. I was just, I'm kind of making these like videos I was making videos at the time partly because I was like, I need to pay my rent. I need a few more tutoring clients. So I just put out like tutoring videos.
Yeah.
And I then, did a few videos on stuff that my students were interested in. I thought this would be really fun, which is sometimes why a lot of my early videos can seem weirdly specific. Like the first video that ever really took off on my channel was a video on Dostoevsky Notes from Underground. And it was because one of my students at the time had read it, and I'd read it, and he was just really interested in it. And so I was like, he was like 15. And I thought, right, I'll make a video on that. And then, you can watch it and we can chat about that the next time we're here. I just thought that it was kind of largely as a resource meant for the people I was currently teaching.
Right.
And then a few of them just took off, and now I just sort of went from there. So I hadn't kind of particularly planned for it to even go well.
Right.
It was largely just a sort of, it was largely just a video archive for the people that I was teaching. And then, I was very lucky. It sort of took off from there.
Well, Joe Folley, thank you very much for coming on the channel, having this really interesting conversation. I am dead certain people will find this very interesting, so I appreciate it.
I hope so.
And I think this will be a good resource for people, and I really enjoyed the conversation. So thank you for coming on.
Oh, thank you for having me.